Right, hi everyone. Might as well start now. Thanks everyone for joining tonight's Python in London. My name is Rory here at Oliver Bernard. Few quick things before we get going. As you will obviously know, there's a waiting list and I'm letting people in as and when, so I'll keep an eye on that. I'm also recording the event, so if anyone comes on late or if anyone knows anyone who wanted to join tonight but couldn't make it, let them know that will be coming up tomorrow. I'll send everyone the link through the meetup group. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Any questions, if you don't just want to stick them in the chat function, is probably easiest. Otherwise, we have people speaking over each other. We will have time at the end for questions as well. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it from my side. Again, thanks everyone for coming. Sorry, there's a few people coming in, so I keep missing them. But yeah, let's crack on. So joined by Sam Scott today, CTO and co-founder of Ozo. Really great talk, adding structure to a sea of chaos around Python, SQL Alchemy, and general authorization. So yeah, over to you, Sam.
Cool, thanks, Rory. Okay, let me share my screen. The whole screen. Yeah, and okay, and also what I'm going to do, I'm going to have the Zoom chat up in a separate window. So please, everyone, do feel free to ask questions throughout. I'll keep an eye on that. So if something comes up, someone wants me to go back and explain something, I can do that. Or like if I miss something, Rory, just let me know. So yeah, I'm Sam, the co-founder and CTO at Ozo. We're primarily based in New York, but kind of distributed and remote now, given current times. Location's a bit less meaningful. Speaking of which, yeah, I'm originally from London, but coming to you from New York today. So I'm co-founder of Ozo. Our kind of mission as a whole, the reason we kind of exist is primarily around making security something that's more accessible for developers. I think it's an area that often gets people often get the wrong impression of it, or like people don't enjoy working on that area, or there's this kind of like this idea that people kind of spread around developers don't care about security. And our kind of viewpoint on that is it's not that people don't care, it's that it's kind of a hard area. It can be very painful if you get it wrong, and the tooling kind of sucks. So we're trying to address that. So here's my outline. I'll give like a very some very small number of slides at the beginning just to kind of lay out the main pieces, clarify authentication, authorization, because they're terms that often get mixed up, and give you some kind of insight into authorization patterns, like sort of a more structured approach to how you'd implement some of these things in your app. But the bulk of this is going to be sort of a practical live demo, looking at a Python app and doing some authorization in it, and I'll talk you through that. I'll kind of go through this reasonably quickly. And then there's like plenty of time and there's plenty of stuff I can go deeper on or explain more, really as much as people are interested. And if no one has other questions, then we'll just leave it there. Okay, so authentication is effectively this process of identifying who you are. So for example, if you go to GitHub, there's not much you can do on GitHub without signing in. You enter your username and password, maybe your two-factor. This is authentication, right? This is the process that GitHub has in place to identify who you are. Right, so you log in, I am authenticated as samsco89. So authorization is a piece where once I'm logged in as a particular user, what am I allowed to do in the app? So for example, here are two URLs on GitHub. One's to see the Ozo HQ organization teams, and one's for Sql Alchemy teams. So as a logged in user, if I visit these two URLs, I get two different results, right? I can see the Ozo teams want Sql Alchemy. And this message here on the Sql Alchemy page is kind of giving me some insight into why. Right, you're not a member of any teams in this organization. So this is, in its essence, authorization. GitHub has decided that if you're not a member of a team in the organization, you cannot see the organization's teams. Authorization in a nutshell. So I can see Ozo because I'm a member of that organization. I'm a member of some of these teams. You can kind of see me here if you squint. Okay, so this is authorization, and this is the piece we're mostly going to be talking about. There is obviously some overlap in, once you've authenticated who the user is, you then kind of need to know what you know about them dictates authorization, and that's where these two kind of cross. So authorization is this kind of, it's a pretty unscoped problem, where I just put it, like deciding who can do what in your app. And so I think given this, most people since forever really have just kind of implemented this in their app without necessarily thinking of this as like a separate, distinct piece or a distinct problem. It's just code that gets written to solve this problem. And what this means is like, if you don't have much structure, you can end up kind of just, ad hoc adding if-else statements, kind of propagating all these like Boolean conditions around to try and determine who can do things. This is kind of fine, maybe like to start with. It like keeps things pretty simple, but it can get like super hard to manage and update over time. And so this becomes like potentially a really painful problem to deal with. So what can we, there are some, despite it seeming like a really unstructured problem, there's actually some very common concepts you can apply to authorization and permissions to sort of make this, a little bit more manageable. And I think roles is a good example of roles. So what roles does, and you might see this abbreviated as RBAC, stands for role-based access control. I'll use the two terms interchangeably. I prefer calling them roles because it's fewer acronyms and all that. So you start with that problem, right? We just have all of our users of the system. We have the resources, the documents or something in the system. Right now, it's like a pretty open-ended problem. And so what roles does is basically says, well, what if we just like group or bucket our users into this thing called a role? It's some name, some identifier for like their relationship with the app, or with say an organization in GitHub. So you probably have very, very few people who really need to like administer the app, expect them to do all things. And most people might be a member. And once you've done that, it doesn't really matter how many users you have because you really just need to think about things in terms of roles. So you might just say, a member can read and write and admins can also delete, right? So we've like turned our like problem of managing all these users into like a very small number of them. This is like good from an implementation perspective because it's like an easier thing to manage, but also from like a user facing perspective. So like here, for example, I have like a slice from the table of permissions for roles for the GitLab app. So GitLab's another version control system, much like GitHub. GitLab's a huge app actually. It does way more than just version control. You can manage your like Kubernetes deployments and CI and all kinds of other things like that. But they've still managed to kind of break things down to just these 5 different roles that you see at the top. That goes from like guest to developer to owner. And they basically categorized everything you can do inside this app into those like 5 roles, which I think as a user is way more manageable. Like I can way easier understand like, oh, I have this person and they shouldn't really need to be able to, change my code or like edit things like that, but I do need them to be able to create issues. Oh, that sounds like a reporter. A reporter can report problems, things like that. And so the thing that roles can do is it gives you this like sort of intuitive grouping to expose to your end users on like the things you can expect to do in your app, right? So like done well, roles have these names like guest or developer that should kind of convey to a user the things you should expect to do in the app. And yeah, as I was saying earlier, implementing this with just like 5 roles is like a more manageable problem than having tons of them. So let's talk about like how you'd actually go about implementing some of these things. And I'll also be talking about OSO, the company / product that I work on. So OSO itself, as well as the name of the company, is the name of our library, which is an open source authorization system for developers. And so this kind of comes in a few different pieces. We have the library itself, which you basically add to your application and use to make these authorization decisions to decide who can do what. And this is available across multiple languages. So in the case of Python, for example, it's pip install OSO and you have OSO available. We also support Node, Ruby, Java, Rust, and Go. Java doesn't get listed here because it doesn't have a nice one-liner. You have to do some stuff with Maven. So, okay, so that's like the core library. But on top of that, we sort of provide a lot of these out-of-the-box authorization pieces, patterns, frameworks, stuff like that for doing things like roles. And that's what I'm going to get into in a second. Basically, the two things together, it's like, here's your system, here's your approach for authorization, and here is just like a bunch of ways to just like apply the patterns and structures you need. And the final piece is like, how do you actually interact with like the OSO library to configure it and things like that? And that's through this policy language. So we create a declarative language specifically for authorization, but it can be used for other things as well. That allows you to write rules to decide who can do what on your app. And so this is what the syntax looks like. So this is a rule here saying that a user is allowed to read an organization if the user is in the organization members. So this is how you'd express this. And as I say, this is like a declarative rule. So you say who can do by what by like representing what you want the end state to look like. Like I want users to read organizations when this is true. I've like declared this as true. Then when you use it in your app, so at the bottom, this might be what it looks like in Python. You call is allowed. You pass in your Python objects, your Python classes, your user object, your organization, and the policy determines if this is true or false based on the policy you wrote. And it's doing it like directly over the Python objects. So when I have here org.members, you can imagine that members is a field or a column on the database or something like that we're checking that the user is in that relationship. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to show you the demo for OSO in a SQL Alchemy app because we have an additional integration with SQL Alchemy. And given that I'm doing that, I kind of wanted to draw some parallels between the two. And this is sort of maybe more of an aspirational comparison because so SQL Alchemy, for those who aren't familiar, is this SQL toolkit that allows you to do everything from like writing SQL expressions, managing your models and data sets using like ORM representations, migrations, things like that. So it's a huge project with a ton of great stuff in it. It's kind of everything you need for SQL. And so we kind of want to be the same to authorization that SQL Alchemy is to SQL. You're like one-stop place to get everything you need for authorization. And we'll see there's like some nice, I hate the word, but there's some nice synergies between OSO and SQL Alchemy. Okay, so I'm going to show you a demo of what this looks like. Basically, it's a very simple GitHub API app that I built using like Flask as the sort of web application piece and SQL Alchemy for the data models. I'll add some very basic authorization and then show you what it looks like using roles, the kind of included roles functionality as well. Okay, so what should I? Okay, so here's my application. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you all. So if I go to my models.py, this is where my SQL Alchemy data models are represented. So you can see I'm like importing the SQL Alchemy declarative base and defining my models. So this is like the SQL Alchemy approach, the ORM approach for defining data models using Python classes. So for example, here I'm defining a users database table, which is represented by this user class, and it has a couple of columns, ID and email, things like that. And so we have users, organizations, repositories. Repositories can belong to organizations. They're like the very core, simple piece of GitHub. That's all we have here. And then our roots, which is the Flask piece, is where we expose some of this data to like a imaginary end user accessing the API. So for example, you can list all repositories in an organization. And so if I was to interact with this API, I need to use curl. It's not a front end, it's just a raw API. If I curl it and I pretend I've done some authentication and that I'm logged in as Paul at Beatles.com, and I try and get the repos for organization 1, I get, this has one repo, Abbey Road, and org2 has this paperwork repo. And so I through this, and this is still just purely on the Flask SQL Alchemy piece, what I can do is kind of make more pieces of my database-backed models accessible from the command line. So for example, I'm going to add a new method that instead of listing repositories, just gives me information about the organization. So here you can see what I'm doing. I have a Flask root endpoint that org/some integer, and that integer is going to get passed through as this like first parameter. I'm going to do a query for organizations matching that ID and get the first one back, and then return a representation of it. So if I add this root to my app, I can now just query for what is org1. Org1 is the Beatles. Org2 is Monsters Inc. Things like that. So that's kind of like Flask and SQL Alchemy. Now, right now I don't have any authorization. Everyone can do everything. I can list all repositories. I can do absolutely everything. And so the way you go about restricting that, adding authorization, is where OSO comes in. And so what this looks like is we basically want to add authorization into these methods to change what we return to the user based on if they're allowed to see it or not. Okay, so the way you generally add OSO to your application is in a couple of steps. You have some piece of logic like this, where I'm going to initialize the OSO library. I'm going to load in my policy files, because remember I said the policy is how I configure who can do what. And I'm going to basically just put this OSO instance on the Flask app available in the state. So now that I have it here, if I import this current app helper from Flask, then what this will allow me to do is, for example, yeah, let's do it here. I can get the current app. I'll get the OSO object off of it, and I'm going to do an authorize method. This is actually built in from the Flask OSO thing. I want to authorize accessing the organization, and the action to use will be read. Okay, so this is, and the current user has actually been automatically populated from Flask as well. Okay, so I'm authorizing, can the user read this specific organization? If I save that, then where did I just add that? I added that to repos index. You see, I'm now getting these 403 forbiddens for anything I try and access. So we're doing authorization. We're preventing people from doing anything, which is not very useful yet. But that's because my policy is completely empty. So I haven't said anyone can do anything. By default, that means like deny everything, right? I haven't explicitly opted anyone in to be able to see anything. I can change that. So I'm going to add a rule to say that any a user can read an organization. Let's type these inputs. So when I add these, like these kind of look like Python typing. They're doing a very similar thing inside OSO. It's actually it's more of a pattern match to make sure that the inputs of those things. I can end there. I can just do a semicolon and be like, I don't want to add any further restrictions. This is effectively saying this is always true. So users can always read organizations. And lo and behold, I can now list repositories again. But this is maybe too much. Maybe I only want people who are at the Beatles.com to read the Beatles organization. Let's say Paul can only access the Beatles. Then I can add some conditions, and I can do so using all of the attributes from my models, from my application data. So I can check that the email address ends in Beatles.com, and say the organization name is actually equal to the Beatles. There's my policy. Can still access number one, and I can't. Sorry, it's listing repositories is what I allowed and denied. So I can list repositories on organization 2, but sorry, on organization 1, but not on organization 2. And you'll see I made this mistake where I accidentally left, organizations themselves still visible, but only enforced authorization on listing repositories, which kind of gives me a nice excuse to show some of the benefits of this approach, which is if I want to do authorization there as well, I just use the same. I use the same OSO call. And I can say I can modify some of these actions. Like maybe this is a list repos action. This is a read action. And I can start doing things like saying, well, maybe you're allowed to list repositories if you can also read a repository, read an organization. So I can do things like define multiple rules. I can have rules calling other rules. And basically OSO is going to handle all of this for me. I don't need to tell it try this, then try this. It'll do the search for me. And then I should then be able to not see org 0. I can't see org 2. I can see org 1. I can list repositories on 1, not 2. I can make this more permissive. You can, what I had before was kind of equivalent to, always allow them to read, but not to list repos, things like that. Okay, so this is the basics of doing authorization and kind of this approach of being able to decide at this kind of object level, can a user read a repository or list repositories on an organization, things like that. I spoke about roles being this useful pattern for authorization. So how do I go from here where I'm doing this manual email org name checking to something more dynamic and generic overall organizations? And that's where the OSO built-in rules comes in. So I'm going to check out, let me just stash these changes. I'm going to check out this branch, which has my roles implementation, but I'm going to reset this so that you can see the exact changes I had to make. Okay, so in my application code, for example, you can see the only diff I have here is I've imported this enable roles method from the Sql Alchemy OSO integration, and then called this method enable roles. So that's all it takes. The models we've changed a little bit as well. So we've imported some helper thing called resource role class, And this is kind of where some of the magic is happening effectively. So what this helper allows us to do is define create a new role as a relationship between users and organizations. So basically what we're trying to get to is a user can have a role in an organization, right? You can be an owner or a member of the Beatles. And that's what this helper does, is creates a mixin, which is like the kind of the way that Sql Alchemy allows you to extend their models and data sets. It gives me a mixin that allows me to create a new Sql Alchemy model, an organization role model, but it's going to basically pre-populate all the fields and columns that I needed to have to allow me to represent roles. So this is like the main change. I now have the ability to say a user can have a role in an organization, and this is reflected in my fixture data. So for example, I've assigned John as an owner of the Beatles. So this is all the dynamic data that lives in the database. Okay. And so the final piece, right? So I've now defined users and roles. Like, how do I use this to do authorization? So it comes into my policy here. So behind the scenes, like the built-in stuff here, OSO is already setting up, like, how do I know what role a user is in? Like, how do I do that as part of my authorization logic? And all it's asking me to do is to define what roles can do. And so it has the similar format to before. We have, instead of allow, we just have role allow. But I don't need to write any of these like conditions over the attributes or any of those kind of things, because that's all being handled by the fact that we're just talking about roles. All that's left for me to do is say, in this first example, anybody with some role in the organization can read that organization. So whatever you are, member, billing, owner, they can all read orgs. But you have to be a member to list repositories, or you have to be an owner to create a new role, things like that. And this is basically like the entirety of my permission system for roles in this app. And I'll make sure this is running again. I mean, what we're going to see is the same behavior from before. Like, users can read, I can read Paul can read repositories in org1, but not in org2. Okay, so that's like the kind of the main piece of doing role-based. Oh yeah, I guess the nice thing here is it's still working for Paul, but we did that manually before. What about like other users? So we have like Sully, who, for example, is I think a member at Monsters Inc., who can see repositories from org2, but not from org1, right? So we have these two organizations. We have roles for them. We have our pretty simple authorization system. So this is like very, very easy to get started with something pretty simple. But I think most people might be like, yeah, I could have probably come up with that myself. But what this gives you is like a very, very solid foundation to allow you to do more powerful things. Like, this allows you to have kind of like inheritance between roles. So anything a member can do, an owner can do. This is actually allowing you to do quite finely scoped roles. So I could have these roles. I could do the same approach I just did with users and organizations on users and repositories, say. And I could even, using like some of the OSO built-in stuff, say that, if you have an organization role, you have a default role in a repository, things like that. So it gives you this like very, very powerful, flexible system that allows you to go pretty far. There's kind of like one other little thing I want to tease before I finish and see if people have any questions and things. So this index I have here is actually more of like an org repos index, which is kind of useful. But what if I want to just allow a user to list all repositories that they have access to? Then it's no longer about me authorizing access to an organization. I need to authorize what repositories. Like, I need to filter this somehow by all things the user can see. So I can maybe like get all the organizations a user belongs to and then list the repositories, or I could, but that logic might start getting complex because a user might be directly an owner of a repository, but not an organization, much like in GitHub. So instead, what OSearch allows you to do is create Sql Alchemy filters from your policy. And so what this looks like, again, so instead of doing this authorize method, I'm again going to get the OSO instance off the app. And I need to do, I need to import authorize model. So we have this is another helper method from Sql Alchemy that's going to allow me to create this filter. And so it takes in a few things. It takes in the OSO instance that I'm getting off the current app. It needs the actor, which is going to be from the kind of state on the Flask app. We can say the action is still going to be read. The model, which is like the thing I don't want to filter, which is going to be a repository. And it needs the Sql Alchemy session as well, so it can do the database query at the end of it. So this is going to give me back sort of authorization filter in a sense that I can use instead of doing any of this like manual organization lookup stuff. I can just tell Sql Alchemy filter repositories by the filter I create. So I can save that. This is now available. Oh, and it doesn't take an org ID anymore. So it's just an index. I believe right now, if I just call that, we're probably going to get nothing back still. Okay, we're not getting any repositories back because we haven't written rules for reading repositories, but we can do that pretty quickly. So basically what I'm going to say is a user is allowed to read a repository, and this should be type checked as a repository. If for the organization that the repository is in, and I need to kind of hint to OSO here that the organization is an organization type so that it does the matching correctly. And the user is allowed to read that organization. So you can read a repository if you also have read access to the organization. Let's like do some kind of simple inheritance thing like that. You know, I can also add additional rules later to say you can read a repository if you're its owner, things like that. If I have that in place, this is organization, thank you. Did that kill my thing? Nope. Okay, cool. I can now list all repositories the user has access to. And the really nice thing that's happening here is this has all been done at the SQL level, right? So this rule was basically turned into a set of constraints or filters on the database, and returned here is this auth filter. So I think if I can actually just print the auth filter. Yeah, so you can see this is kind of the query that it's going to execute. So select organizations repositories where organization ID is 1 basically, or ID 1, whatever the the value that's passed in from the user. So it's kind of nice. Like a user here could belong to multiple organizations. They could have their own repositories. The authorization logic is staying in the app, but the kind of data filtering is happening like in SQL. So it's handled very efficiently. Cool. So those are kind of the main things I wanted to cover. Here are some links that I'm going to just drop in the Zoom chat to make it easier for everyone instead of trying to copy them down now. And I'm very much happy to go deeper on kind of anything that I spoke about today, like authorization models. I can talk about, what's, you might have heard about like RBAC and ABAC, like what's the difference between those, more details about OSO and what's happening, or just general topics. But yeah, I guess thanks all for listening.
Any questions from anyone? Or is everyone happy? Just give it a second, just in case.
It's not exactly a question about the library itself, but if there's time, I was kind of curious at how you arrived at maintaining an authorization library for a couple of languages, because that seems a bit unusual.
So yeah, I mean, so you're kind of asking really, what are the origins of the company and how do we end up here? So basically where this all started out, I met my co-founder Graham almost 3 years ago now. And we very much clicked on this idea of like, security is this area that just seems like underserved from the developer tooling standpoint. It's this kind of like annoyingly gatekeepered thing, like very much like, oh, it needs to be in InfoSec and an area that people are often hands off on. So that was like the problem we wanted to address. How we ended up on authorization is we went out and spoke to hundreds of companies. And the thing we just heard again and again was that people ended up building this themselves from scratch. They would often go through like 3-4 like lengthy refactors because they'd start off and they'd be like, admin and user, that's enough. And it'll be like a Boolean flag on the database. And they're like, we need more granularity. Let's do some roles. So they'd build roles. And they were like, but we need, multi-tenant roles. They need to be scoped to an organization. So they'd do like another 6-month refactor and like, and on and on and on. And it seemed like an area that no one was ever like very happy with. And it's just like this area that people felt like was a lot of pain. And so we were kind of very interested in kind of seeing what we can do to solve that area. Turns out the reason it probably hasn't been solved in the past is it's a very hard problem to solve like abstractly, because it is this kind of like very open-ended problem. But kind of where we landed was we wanted to give people a library that they could just add to their application, because a lot of authorization in our view like has to happen there in the app, because like I just showed, it's using app data, belonging to an organization or repository. Like you're not going to pull that out of the app. GitHub would be hard to function if it didn't manage that data itself. So we knew we wanted it to be a library, but we wanted it to be something that people could use consistently across any app, any framework. So when we started building it, we knew that we built the core library in Rust, and we kind of designed it so that it'd be easy to embed in other languages, which is like a whole other topic. But effectively, you have this like Rust core with like bindings into things like Python and Ruby to allow us to sort of a lot of the power of this has been done in that one place in the Rust code, and the sort of language libraries are somewhat thin wrappers on top of that. But yeah, what we really wanted to strive for was, a single tool that people could use across like multiple teams and just have that like consistency of approach, and like, share the knowledge, share policies, that kind of thing.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Nice.
Anyone else?
So before we finish, actually, there's one thing I would love to do as well. I'd love it if we could just take like a minute, and if everyone could maybe write down in the Slack chat, like one thing they took away from the talk or one thing they learned. It'd really help me basically, improve and know where my information is going in the talk. So if everyone could just, I'm just going to be silent for like a minute. If everyone could just like write down something they took away, that'd be super helpful. Just see more alternative secure routing. Could you maybe expand on that? What you mean by alternatives to secure routing? I can do my best to interpret the question, but I'm not fully clear on it. So there's one thing I'm doing here, which is doing this like authorization inside these methods. So this is like in the Flask views, basically, where I'm kind of adding my application code to decide what to return to the user. There's like an alternative approach that is on the surface very appealing, which would be to do this as like a kind of generic middleware. And basically what that kind of relies on is the idea that maybe I can determine if someone should be allowed to access org/1/repos if they're a member of org1. And I can probably figure that out from the URL, right? Like the information is there in the path. I can look up the organization. I can decide if you have access or not. The problem is that's often not necessarily like enough. So sometimes you can't do everything. There's a kind of few problems with this. It's like, one, you might be doing some like redundant database lookups. So like if in the middleware, I look up organization 1, make a decision. Yeah, it seems related to this question as well. Like, why not decorate the function with it rather than put it inside the function? So like there are kind of two questions both relating to like where to do the middleware. So like if you try to do it on like the root level, you might end up doing redundant lookups. Like I look up the organization and then I make a decision, and then I return, and then in the method body, I might look it up again and then do some filtering. In the case of this like index endpoint, like there's no authorization I could do just on the like generic endpoint, because this is really my authorization, is where I'm filtering the data. There's like, you can do something, there's like more you can do though. Like we have previously like done examples of where like you could do something like you could maybe add a decorator that does authorization and returns something from it. So maybe, maybe you have like an authorized decorator, and this is going to take in like org ID, and then like maybe it's like auth result, something like that, where maybe like we make authorize clever enough to know how to return data back. Basically where this ends up being like very powerful is when you have like very, very structured APIs. So for example, there's another Python framework called Django, which has this like Django Rest framework kind of extension, where data is like very, very structured, right? So like it's very RESTful, like this means exactly what it says it means, and you can kind of implement this all as a generic filter. Where that gets tricky is if the business logic inside the method is maybe somewhat different to what is expressed, then it can be hard to do. But it's absolutely something you can kind of try, you can do, but in that case it's kind of abstract out when it makes sense to. Once you can start seeing what the patterns are, it's like with anything in coding, this is the OSO can kind of do anything. I kind of prefer our syntactic as having alternate function. Yeah, it's definitely a trade-off. I mean, you can we're already in the case of this one, we're auto populating like the current user. You could maybe infer the action from the name of the method, like maybe you can get rid of the action instead, like things like that. Like you can kind of gradually make it cleaner and cleaner and do stuff like that. But one, I kind of wanted to keep the example simple, and two, it's explicit can be nice here. So there's another comment from Abby as well saying, missed most of it. I think Rory's recording this meetup, and so we'll make this available afterwards.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, so I've recorded it, well, still recording now. I'll upload it to YouTube tomorrow, but I know Ozo are going to share it on their channels as well. So yep. I saw there are a few people who were sort of 5 or 10 minutes late. So once that comes up, obviously feel free to have a look and scroll back to anything you missed. Yep.
I'll also say we're always happy just to talk authorization we have like a community Slack here at this URL. It's like the invite link for it. We're always happy to discuss authorization and also stuff like that there. Or we've got various documentation on some of these things.
I've put all those links on the meetup group as well. I'm sure we'll have taken them down by now.
Thank you.
Just in case. Yeah.
I see another question. I know we're covering RBAC in this meeting, but which auth architecture could fit better with OSO? OAuth plus RBAC, JWT plus OAuth plus RBAC. Yeah, so this is an area where we've sort of the kind of intersection between authentication and authorization here is an interesting one. So in here, like the main piece I was focusing on is the idea of using application data, relationships between users and app data, right? So we created roles as a many-to-many model between users and repositories, and that's what we use in our policies. Things like OAuth and JWT, they can actually kind of overlap with this really nicely. So, okay, remember, again, this is our like example GitHub application. This is like our GitHub API. Now, one of the things that GitHub does allow you to do is create scoped API tokens, right? So maybe I want to write like a script. I want to give access to some third-party whatever to access my like GitHub repositories. I want to give them restricted access. I don't want them to do everything I can do. So what this might look like in OSO is just like additional information that comes in on the input. So we typically call this first input an actor because it can represent more than just a user. It could be a user or like an API key or something. So imagine if I had something like, actor is an API token, and I'm going to say like whatever action and resource. I can maybe determine what this API token is allowed to do by combining what the app thinks the user can do plus what the token is allowed to do. So maybe it's like, maybe this is read repository. If like the read repository scope, so this is like a kind of a classic way to write, express what a token can do in like JWT scope land. So maybe have like the actor.scopes or claims or something. Let's call them scopes. And like allow actor dot, let's call this token to make that clearer. Token dot user can read the repository. Right, so here we might like be combining two of these things. So to be able to read a repository, you must have been granted this by the token itself, and the underlying user should be allowed to do the thing you're trying to do, right? So like the token can't magically access someone else's repositories, and it shouldn't even be able to do what you gave it access to. This pattern is kind of generally what we recommend for anything as it relates to like using more information from the user. So maybe you're actually managing your users in a third-party service, you know, like Okta or Auth0 or like Azure AD or whatever it is, then as long as that information is accessible on the user, you're good. You know, so you could like read. You know, we have examples of this in our on our blog as well. Like for like Azure, for example, like pulling the groups from Active Directory and using those in your policy, and just kind of you just think of that as additional attributes on the user. No problem.
Great. So yeah, that looks like everything. So thanks again, Sam. Really great talk and some good questions. So cheers, everyone. Yeah, you know, please have a look at Ozo if you've got a chance. Look a bit more into them. And Sam, if anyone's got any questions about the Python market in general, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn or email. I think most of us have spoken over email looking at the names on today's event. I also host a sister group called Golang in London. So keep an eye on that, and obviously this Python group for future events. Also, if you go on Oliver Bernard's website, on the community section, my colleagues are doing similar events in other areas of technology. So keep an eye out for that, see if anything looks of interest. But yeah, unless anyone's got any last minute questions, keep an eye out for the video, which I'll be sharing through the meetup sometime tomorrow. And yeah, all the best.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thanks,
guys.
yep.
Bye.